Dum-dum-dum-dum-dum. Maybe you didn't get that.
All right. Yeah, we did.
Yeah,
And we will not delete anything.
can't delete anything off of the tape. Is it cool enough or hot enough or just about right? Because I can put the heat or the air conditioning on or whatever.
It's kind of like Baby Bear's Porch to me.
What's
It's
that?
kind of like Baby Bear's Porch to me.
Well, it's nice to see everybody here this evening for the second year of the Ministry Study Program and the Academy of Theological Studies. You know, we have combined the two programs, that is for the cluster and for the local churches, and have added that to the curriculum of the St. John Academy so that you're a blend of both Academy people and cluster people and local churches. So as a result, this is an ecumenical group. I know we have Episcopalians back here. We have Missouri Synod Lutherans registered. I don't see them here yet. And we have ELCA Lutherans. Do we have any other? Oh, we have Methodists too.
Right.
Yes, yes. And so it's an ecumenical gathering. We have some Roman Catholics who are registered into the program too. And of course the Academy itself is ecumenically, broadly ecumenical anyhow. Tonight we begin the second year of the Ministry Study Program, which is the 2-year curriculum of which you have a syllabus or curriculum overview in your packet. And you'll see that in terms of the 5 or 6 terms, 3 terms of year 1, 3 terms year 2. And we have so far in term 1 considered the foundation of the Christian faith in the, that was an in-depth study of the Old Testament last fall. And then in the March term, we had the overview of the New Testament with Father Caney, and then you had the theological view with Pastor Kidd in the spring term in May. Today's term is term 4, the beginning of this second year, and this course is designed to give us an overview of the development of the Christian church from its origins as the beginnings of Christ and his ministry through the apostolic witness, and then how the church has developed its teachings, its witness, its creeds, and its theology throughout these centuries. We'll essentially then, in the March term, will be taught by Pastor Leach on stewardship, discipleship, and discipline, and then the final term of next spring will be living the truth, or living the Christian life, devoted to the issues of worship, prayer, study, and a devotional life. And it'll be taught by myself, as well as Pastor Caney and Pastor Klinker. So it is a well-shaped, well-conceived 2-year curriculum, of which at the end you will receive a certificate of participation. In addition to this basic curriculum, we will continue to have offerings of the Academy, and that is what's on the additional sheet that you have, which lists all the different topics and course offerings that we offer within the structure of St. John Academy. And these are offered both in day terms and in evening terms. Now, I know many of you were in the day term in the beginning of the summer when we talked about St. James the Just and the development of early Christianity. And then we were planning on having one over the summer, but due to my schedule and the construction schedule here, we kind of, they utilized the summer to store stuff in this room and so on as they're installing the elevator, etc. So it did, but need not fear, we will make that up with another offering for you in the coming months. So between our lectures, our normal lecture schedule, there'll be additional offerings of the Academy, of which you see topics here. Last time we looked at these topics, you rated them according to your interest. And we have tabulated those, and it's very interesting. And we will begin offering those courses based on your the highest rank first of those that you're most interested in. So it'll be a good year, as always, and we appreciate your enthusiasm and your continued interest and participation. Now let me say before we begin just something about this course. This is always, as you know, at the university and the colleges when I teach, the first session is always some orientation. And I wanted to say just briefly how I've conceived this course for us. We're limited to 8 lectures, 2 lectures an evening, 4 evenings, with a reading week in the 3rd week. So we'll meet tonight, next Tuesday, then we have the 3rd week off for reading and preparation. And then there is a possibility of us going to see the Luther film on that 4th week. However, it's been brought to my attention that many people here have already seen the film because it has appeared on PBS, and I guess it's on a rotating basis. So we may make that an optional activity if you wish. I'll speak more about that later. And then we have a possible conflict the last Tuesday of October, being that it's Halloween. And I didn't want all of you to come in costume that night. And I know T was just afraid of big gorillas and everything, big pumpkins and all kinds of stuff. So, and then some people have said they really want to be home during that time when the kids, 5 to 7 or whatever. So think about this week, and we can talk about next week, of flipping that a week to 1 week later, the first Tuesday of November. However, that also is a conflict, right? But I think we could vote before 6:30, most of us. So I don't see that as a conflict, a terrible conflict. But the one on Halloween I do understand, and many of you have grandchildren and like to be with them during Halloween or so on, or maybe you live in areas where you get along Halloweeners, or you just don't want your windows soaked. I know the real cause. I know the real cause. So, so those may be a couple shifts, but next week let's work that out. You think about it between now and then, and we'll discuss that. Now here's how I conceive this course. As you know, most of you know that I've taught history at the university level for years, and we have obviously much more time to accomplish what we wish. We're talking about 2,000 years of history here, and obviously in a college curriculum or in a seminary schedule as we teach it, that would be over an entire year, or meeting 3 or 4 times a week for 10 weeks or 12 weeks. Obviously here, we're trying to compress 2,000 years into 4 evenings, 8 lectures. So obviously we have to be very cursory. We have to kind of jump across and hit the high points. As a result, what I'm going to do is try to talk about the turning points in Christian history. That is, the things which really caused the major changes or modifications or the great teachings or the great personalities or the great movements that occurred in Christian history, which really has made a difference and brought us to where we are today. So here's my suggestion of how to approach this. I've given a lot of thought to this, to do justice to this. And I think what we'll do is this first section of lectures tonight will be on the origins of Christianity. That is, looking at the foundational people, namely Christ, and the foundational people, the apostles, the disciples, and the early first Christians in, let's say, the 1st century between Christ's birth and death, and then out to about the last gospel writer, St. John, in the 90s. And then to move into the 2nd century, which brings us to the time of the great heresies, which become known as the great heresies, and I'll talk about that. of how the church was wrestling with what would become the orthodox teachings of the church, or what we know today. So the first 2 or 3 centuries, I think we'll talk about tonight. And if time works out okay, we'll get to the Nicene period, in which the Nicene Creed becomes the formula of the faith that we all confess on Sunday mornings, and then conclude that evening with these great councils. The second evening, we'll move through a radical period of time of Christianity in which the Eastern and Western Church fractures. And this is where you get the Orthodox churches of the East, the Eastern Orthodox, and the Roman Church, or the Western Church, fractures. It is also a period of the Crusades and the opening of the hostilities and all the kind of baggage that goes into the Crusades to free the Holy Land from the Muslims who had captured the Holy City. And we'll look at the captivity of the church. That is, where the church becomes a political institution, so that the bishops become electors. That is, they become governors, and they have enormous power and enormous wealth through this period of the Crusades, because it is the kings and so on, with the imprimatur, or the blessing of the popes and the hierarchy, the papacy and so on, to do these great military adventures. And so we'll look at what is known as the captivity of the church, in which church and state become one, and you inherit power by ecclesial authority. Kings, for example, are crowned by popes and given authority, ecclesial authority, godly authority, in what becomes known as the Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne is one of the examples of that. Karl the Great. The third unit I think we'll look at is the major issues of the Reformation. This is important tonight for us, and certainly in this month, in which we're edging ever closer to a celebration of, or a commemoration of, the 500th year of the Reformation. And we as Lutherans are quite aware that this is a major, major moment in Lutheran church history, but in church history in general. So we want to do justice to what the issues were of the Reformation, where we were then, and to try to see where we are now, and in particularly relation to Roman Catholics, but also to other Protestants throughout the world, and where we fit into this scheme. And also to recognize that there are other major players in the Reformation world. And that is the Anglicans, or the Church of England, known as the Episcopal Church in this country. But they were major players at the same time that Luther was conducting the Reformation on the continent. It was very shortly thereafter that the major English church began to grow and blossom and became independent. And then the good Scots and the Presbyterians are right around the corner, and they are exercising similar kind of Reformation ideas, and the entire, what we know as the Protestant church, begins to bloom and flourish. And so to do justice to that period, we want to look at the Reformation origins, and then look at how the church has bloomed into so many branches and so many, somebody has said there are over 40,000 denominations. Imagine that, 40,000 denominations. I mean, it might be 39,999. I might be off one, but the point is there's an awful lot of denominations. And we have to look at that. So, and that would be our third unit. And then our fourth unit, I want to bring you up to contemporary Christianity. Because I know you have a lot of questions, as most people do, about evangelicals and the rise of of revivalism and the Assemblies of God and the great flourishing of the evangelical churches, and all these conflicts, you know, between science and religion and evolution and gay rights and civil rights and all those kind of things. I think we need to do justice to that, to see how the church has dealt with that, continues to deal with those themes. And in the end, I think that when we wrap up, as we're all weary by having come through all that, and I'll take to my chair and I'll say, we're done now for the term. We will have done, I hope, a very good job of winding you through what is an extremely interesting history. Now, I know that there are some people that history was not their favorite subject. I can't imagine that, but I know that there might be some. And mainly it was because it was taught perhaps in a very dull way of facts and figures and dates and all that stuff you had to memorize. But what I want to do for you is to capture the themes and the excitement and the people and the interesting personalities which have made this church what it is today. So, and the fascinating debates and the little intricacies, and I'll tell you all these little secrets behind the scenes of Luther, what was really going on, and what he was thinking, and what they were doing, and how it all played out. And I think you'll find that, hopefully you'll find, that this history will be much more exciting and much more interesting than most of the history that you've been exposed to. So that's the overview. Now let us begin by thinking about what history is in the first place. We study history because it shows us where we've been. I have a friend of mine that just had that Ancestry.com or whatever. Do you know what that is? That's where you take a little swab of your mouth and you send it in, and all of a sudden you find that you're a Neanderthal, right? You have Neanderthal origins. There's some people, I thought that before, but now that's been confirmed. Somebody said to me, he said, have you sent yours? I said, no, I'm not sending mine in. I don't want to be told I'm a Neanderthal, you know. But it's interesting, people have this sort of interest in where they came from and you know, our roots, our origins. Somebody in your family probably did what my family did. I had an Uncle Bob that loved to do family history. And he was the one that went back and did genealogy. Did you ever have anybody in your family do that? Oh, yeah. You know, the tree. You know, Uncle John was related to Uncle Vincent, and Cyrus was, and you know, you're so confused, you know, of who's related to whom and who was an aunt and an uncle and so on. But it is interesting. And I recently picked up a book that is written on our family's history. And I found it, amazingly, I found it on Amazon. And who would have thought? And so I knew some of the history, but I wasn't sure of some of the history. Now, the section there where they were poachers on the king's property, I know that's just wrong. Because we never did anything that wasn't, you know, right up there. I keep looking forward to seeing, you know, when I was a king, you know. I don't like all this peasant stuff, you know, that's in there, you know, like, yeah. But it's really interesting. I found that there was, which I had known because I went into a museum one time, and I had heard from Uncle Bob that there was a famous rifle that was called the Schreckengast long rifle, and it was made in Pennsylvania. I happened to be over at Guilford Lake, and there used to be a little museum over there. I don't remember. Has anybody ever seen that? It was like an Indian reserve, a little Indian thing, and they had a lot of Indian relics, and you know, the Delaware Indians were in this area. I remember once as a kid digging down in the backyard and discovering arrowheads right in my backyard. So I was in this little museum, and I said to the guy, I said, have you ever heard of a Schreckengast long rifle? He said, oh, absolutely. And he goes up to the thing, and he says, here's one, look at this. I said, wow, that's terrific. He said, yeah, they were very famous. And they had perfected this accuracy by cutting grooves in the barrel so that the ball would spin and have much more accuracy and so on. So it's a real interesting, so those are the kind of interesting things, you know, to know about your family background. So we study history so that we can have a better grasp of where we've come and who we are. And certainly as Christians, this is a really important thing. I mean, it's nice to carry these denominational labels, but if somebody really asks you, what is a Lutheran? What is an Anglican? What is a Presbyterian or a Methodist? Can you really give a really good answer to that, or is it just sort of, well, I don't know, you know, my parents were Methodists, so I'm a Methodist, and, well, why are you, or what's the difference, or so on. So we need to know those things. The second thing is, and I think the most important thing, is that it gives us a sense of how God has acted over the centuries. That this thing called the church is not just simply an accident of birth, nor is it a conception of man, that they just thought, well, you know, gee, if this Christianity is to last, we better make it into something really formal and complex and so on. But to know that God has used human minds and abilities and so on. Come on in. We're just talking about you. No, not really, not really. Here's a couple seats up here in the front.
Oh, good.
Right here.
Yeah, I've got the books over there.
But that this Christian church, which we so love and have found so important in our lives, has come through an extraordinarily interesting pattern of nooks and crannies and side roads and main roads and so on, but all through the Holy Spirit or God's power has worked. And that it is not by accident that this, what we call the Christian church, has lasted for over 2,000 years. No other human institution, none, no government, no country, no institution has ever lasted the way the church has. There is no Roman Empire any longer, and it was the greatest of the greatest. How long will there be a United States of America? We're out a few hundred years, but will we last 2,000? I don't know. I mean, that's in God's hands. But the point is that nothing in human history has lasted the way the church has, which indicates to you and to us that there is a divine origin here. Nothing could survive this long, with this much challenge, these many hills and valleys, and has survived with the strength that it has. And so you see through the threads of history these marvelous points in which God's hand was active. I often, those of you who are parishioners here at St. John's know that one of the things we always try to do in sermons and meditations, homilies, is to connect it with your life. That these stories are not just sort of abstract things out here, but they have a direct teaching and ministry to you. And so the beauty of this history will be that you will see how God has worked in the lives of people significantly in times and places to bring to fruition the marvelous miracles that we call the ministry of Christ. And that we are inheritors of a huge and marvelous heritage. And to be called Christians is not just a casual thing. It is an enormously meritorious thing. In other words, Christ's hands has inscribed the sign of the Holy Cross on your forehead in baptism. You are claimed by a living God who leaves you not alone but follows you all the days of your life. At hills and valleys, and turns and twists and mistakes and errors, and always is there in a redemptive way to encourage you as one of his children. And so as we see this history, we're going to see that the children of God have had the hand of God upon them as it's moved through this fabulous little journey. journey. It's like a bubbling trout stream, you know, it just keeps rolling. I love that hymn, I'm like an ever-rolling stream. God help in ages past, our help for years to come. You know that one. Okay, well that's enough singing for tonight. But you get the point. So this is why this is important. So let's begin. We begin by thinking about where it all started. Many movements start by a scholarly or an abstract theory or an invention or an idea that takes root. For example, if we're looking at science, we would know that, for example, Einstein developed the theory of relativity. And from the theory of relativity, then through the beginning and up to current day, it's been looked at, modified, people follow it, people reflect upon it, people mold it, people shape it, and just recently, within about 48 hours or so, Gesundheit, they have confirmed Einstein's theory by an outer space exploration, black holes and so on. So, very interesting. However, Christianity has such a unique start because it starts with a cult, and I don't mean that in a negative way, a cult of personality. That is, it all shapes not on idea or a philosophy or a teaching, but it shapes on a person. Everything that we are as Christians is revolving around Christ. One individual, who he was, and what he taught. So it's a unique kind of thing. It's not like a philosophy that somebody dreams up in the back room and then becomes popular. It's not like the great founders of American democracy. It's not like Locke and Rousseau and others that talked about the rights of human beings and the common man and so on. But here it is, a one-person beginning. Now, what do we know about Jesus himself? I must confess, as you know, that have been with me in other Academy lectures, that the material we have about Jesus is pretty skimpy. I wish it were a lot more. I just did a recent bibliographical sketch of John Adams. One of my favorite historians is McCullough, David McCullough. By the way, anything David McCullough writes, it's the most wonderful reading material. One of his latest books that I just think is just a terrific read is The Wright Brothers. Right here in Ohio, right in Dayton, Ohio, but it's just a wonderful little book. Pick it up, David McCullough, The Wright Brothers. If you look at John Adams, you can go through literally pages and pages and pages of biographical material, autobiographies, writing, historical research, PhD thesis, all this kind of thing. And there's an enormous amount of material on John Adams. Mainly because, or at least partially because, John Adams was a copious letter writer. He kept a diary and he wrote every day of his life, and he wrote to his wife, Abigail, all the time. And all these letters, these collections of letters for decades, are all available to us in the archives. They're fabulous readings. If you want to read a real love story, you read between John Adams and Abigail. And then his letters to his son, John Quincy Adams, who later becomes president himself, as you remember. Or if you don't remember, you now know. Okay? They were related. That was his son. And, of course, these are fabulous writings. You can read on Jefferson. You can read on Washington. Franklin has a lot of research and material. But unfortunately, when we come to Jesus, we're limited to approximately 4 short books called the Gospels. Now, there's a reason for that, and it's partially due to the fact that in the first century life, people did not write. They were basically illiterate. And only a few people were the well-educated, the wealthy, or certain people called the scribes and others, had the ability to read and write. Most history at the New Testament world, the first century, was oral history. Meaning, you tell me a story, I remember it, and I pass it on to the next generation. My Uncle Bob, I go back to him tonight. Now, he's going to be famous before this night's over. But Uncle Bob was one that had 1 million stories. Now, I don't know how many of them were really true, but they were really interesting. And as a little boy, I was fascinated to study them. Because, see, Uncle Bob, his father had been in the Kaiser's Black Guard, Horse Guard in Germany. And so he had all these wonderful stories about, back before World War I and so on, and the Kaiser and all that stuff. But then he came to the United States and he had these wonderful stories. Now, most of the things that I know about my family's history came from my Uncle Bob. Because he had been told it, he remembered it, he had researched it, and he knew it. I have wonderful remembrances of my mom and dad telling stories about my great-grandparents, who I never met. But I learned of them through the stories of my mother and dad. I know my grandparents because they were still living when I was little, and I knew that my grandfather worked at the Pennsylvania Railroad and all different things, and I wouldn't know that had it not been passed along orally. But there is a problem with oral translation or transmission. And what is that?
Something gets added, something gets lost.
That's right. It tends to be not as factual as somebody that would have a tape recorder and just recording, or a video camera and recording the event. It tends to be an impression. You sort of grasp what happened there. If there's an accident, God forbid, I hope you've never been in one, but if you have, you know that the police take your statement, right? And they take the statement of the other person. And your statement says, I was completely innocent, the light was green, and that other guy just flew through here on the red light and hit me. And this policeman then comes over, now, what'd you say? The light was green, and that guy over there went through the light and hit me. Now, who's right? Well, we might say we look for another non-biased source, right? A bystander, who happened to be there eating their Wendy's when they saw this crash.
Sure didn't have an attack of gas at the time.
That's right. And so the person that is witnessing it has their own impressions of it. And if you have a couple people, they'll say, no, Mom, that wasn't the way it was at all. It was this way. No, dear daughter, it wasn't this way. So the point is that oral transmission is not exactly always accurate. Now, it doesn't mean that it is inaccurate. It means that sometimes it gets embellished, changed, modified, depending on who's telling the story and for what purpose they're telling the story. You see, if I have a little boy and I'm teaching him about what it means to do good things, I'll say to Bobby, Bobby, if you do good things, you get good things back. For example, now, I know you did some, you made your bed this morning, and so Mom has made cookies, and you can have some cookies. On the other hand, if you didn't make your bed this morning, you don't get any cookies. Okay, so a person is beginning to be shaped by rewards and so forth. In other words, they begin to know if they do certain things. Okay? So now Bobby comes out, and Mom says, hi, Bobby, how are you today? He says, good, I made my bed. Great. Let's go see. Right? So Mommy and Bobby go, the bed's not made. Uh-oh. Now what's happened? Bobby is thinking of the reward. He changes the story so that it meshes with the reward, right? So it's possible that in oral translation and transmission sometimes, an oral story will be changed according to the circumstance. Now, there are many ways to interpret the Bible. One way is to look at the Bible. Those of you who have been with me in Academy know that you can interpret the Bible strictly literally. That is, the story is exactly what it is and nothing more. What you read is what you get. And for many Christians, that's the level in which they read biblical stories. So if a biblical story says he fed 5,000, it meant that there is exactly 5,000 people there being fed. Right? So here's an apostle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. How many loaves? 7, 8, 9. How many fish? 10, 11. Be an awful lot to get to 5,000. Now, interestingly, the Gospels themselves pick this up because it'll say 5,000 were fed, and then there were other people there too, women and children and visitors and so on. So, actually, 5,000 might not be accurate. Now, the point is not to be totally destroyed in your faith, but to think is the 5,000 the point of that whole story? Of course not. And when you're reading things like this, you begin to say, what is Jesus trying to teach in the story? And could it be that the gospel writer said 5,000 because, well, have you ever gone to a football game at YSU or whatever, and you go home and people say, gee, are they getting the crowds like they used to have up there? How many would you, well, I said there must be at least 5,000 or 6,000 there today. Well, there was actually 3,500. But in your impression, you're trying to give an impression. So what we have often in the gospel accounts is not inaccuracies, because the Bible is never inaccurate in the sense of what it's trying to pursue or to convey. But what we're doing is we're getting impressions, an impression. I've often used this example in the academy. If we were to take a blank sheet of paper, and I gave you some crayons, because we all like to color. In fact, I've been amazed they have these adult coloring books.
Oh, yeah.
I got 5 of them for Christmas. I don't know what that was telling me. I hear you get more childlike as you get older. Maybe that was what they were saying, I don't know. But if I were to give you these pieces of paper and some crayons, and I gave you, I put a little still life, a little bowl of fruit here and some flowers and vases and so forth, and I said, draw me a picture of it. I bet that every picture that was drawn here would be what? Different. You got it. Why? Because you're giving an impression of what you see. Now, it's not like a photograph where I take a selfie, you know, like this, of the fruit bowl back there. But these are impressions. And when you get an impression, it's what impacts or influences you the most. What impressed you the most? So you see a difference between the 4 gospel writers based on what their impression or what was most important to them to record. Isn't it interesting, for example, that Mark has no birth story at all? Now, you may not remember that. And yet Mark is supposed to be the first gospel written. Okay? So actually the Bible's out of order. It should be Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, rather than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You know why it's out of order? Because Mark doesn't have a birth story. Matthew does. You want to put the birth story first, because if you're going to start reading the Bible, you want to know where Jesus came from, right? If you start with Mark, he's at John the Baptist already. What happened to all the adolescents? All his background. So you see, for Mark, perhaps, and we'll never know because we can't interview him, the birth story was not central. It was not as important to Mark as it was to Matthew and Luke. Do you know that John has no birth story? John starts way back in intergalactic space in the beginning. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and so forth. I mean, he goes way back. So the important thing is that each of these Gospels become a portrait or a sketch or a quick view of this marvelous person called Jesus. And the writers of these Gospels then reflect what becomes most important to them to record. Now, we know that the first three Gospels are called, as you learned in the spring term, they're called synoptics, which means they have a certain synergy or a certain relatedness, all three Gospels. However, John is so different than the first three that it takes a different tact. And since John is written last of the four Gospels, John perhaps had read or knew of the other Gospels and filled in the blanks of what the other Gospels missed. For example, if we would not have had John's Gospel, the last one, we never would have had the I am statements. I am the good shepherd, I am the bread of life, and so on. Wouldn't we be poorer if we didn't have that? And so what John is recalling or filling in the gaps, each is sort of correcting or adding to. Maybe Matthew, who had Luke to look at, not Luke, Matthew had Mark to look at as sort of a skeleton framework. When Matthew's writing, he said, well, gee, he doesn't even have the birth story in. I better write the birth story in because people are going to forget what it was. We also know that there were, in more recent scholarship, we know that there are other source materials that perhaps was used by the gospel writers. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but we also know that there is a source material, we think, because there's threads that are in all the Gospels, called Q. Now, Q is from the German word Quelle, meaning source. And so it looks very strongly like to scholars that Mark had available to him when he wrote the first Gospel a source of people that had written things down, sayings. And from that, he amplified or wrote with Matthew was looking at probably Q and Mark. There's another interesting gospel that has been discovered within our lifetime. It's called the Gospel of Thomas. Now, Thomas didn't make the cut to get in the New Testament, and there's really good reasons why, because there's some strange things in Thomas. There's no storyline. It's made up of 120-some sayings, just expressions. It's like somebody that was there listening to Jesus and just wrote down things he said that impressed him. And this source called Q and then Thomas may have been the source of some of the stories that get into one gospel and not another. There's a big debate of how old Thomas is. Most scholars list it in the 2nd century, so it probably didn't influence the Gospels. However, Helmut Kessler and some other scholars, Harvard and other places, believe it's one of the earliest writings, Thomas, of which maybe Matthew, Mark drew from as source materials. But being that said, we know that what essentially was happening is they were remembering, out of their own personal experience, their relationships with Jesus. Now, you have to also understand that when the Gospels were written, they were written a long time after the event. Perhaps as many as 20 years after the event. I don't know about your mind, but mine, after 20 years, gets a little sketchy on things. I might remember the high points of something, but I don't know the details. I don't remember the details. Somebody else will say, well, yeah, didn't you remember? Remember when Grandma, remember that turkey that fell off the table when you were 3 years old? No, I don't remember that. Do you remember when you pulled the Christmas tree down at Grandmother's, you know? You pulled on the string, your foot got caught in the thing and the tree went over? Do you remember that? No, I don't remember that. So there's selective memory too. So and you've experienced that, selective memory.
Oh, yeah.
So what we have then in the Gospels is an impression. The most important things in the life of Jesus are remembered, obviously. You would remember the resurrection, you'd remember the crucifixion. Who could forget those? You would remember the baptism with John the Baptist because he was such an important person. You would remember the feeding of the great crowds, be that 5,000 or 3,000. You know, both stories are in the Gospels. One says 3, one says 5. Doesn't make any difference how many people were there. It was just a huge amount of people. You'd remember that. You'd remember that Jesus was a healer, wouldn't you? And that goes throughout the Gospels. There's a correspondence, that is an agreement with the Gospels, that Jesus was a profound teacher. He had enormous ability to take the simple, to take the complex and make it simple, and a huge ability to be a rabbinic teacher. That is, a rabbi teaches by stories. If you ask a rabbi oftentimes about some point, he doesn't give you, well, first point, second point, third point, fourth point. He'll say, let me tell you a story. There once was a man and this and that, much like Jesus did. Say, take the Good Samaritan story. Jesus is questioned, and Jesus says, let me tell you a story. Once was a man that was going down the road, and he was attacked by thieves, fell by the way of the wayside. And then all kinds of important people came down the line, but they didn't have time to take care of it. And interestingly enough, Jesus weaves into that story that there were religious people. Imagine that. Religious people that came down the street and didn't have any compassion on somebody that had fallen down into the gutter. Now I wonder what Jesus was teaching there. I stroke my proverbial beard like a rabbi, and I say, do you draw anything out of that? Like, does this have any meaning to your life as a religious person? Would you possibly be called a hypocrite in your life because you claim to be religious and yet for some reason aren't religious or don't do what the teachings tell you to do? So you see, that was hugely, it had a huge impression. And so it comes into the gospel stories, and these things are accurate in substance. May not be exact in detail, but the detail doesn't make any difference. Doesn't make any difference you see, it doesn't make any difference whether it was a man fell in the ditch or a woman. Does it really? No. So, but the point is, it's a matter of reaching out and helping one's neighbor. Yeah.
I was thinking another good illustration, that would be the story of Jesus and the centurion.
Yes.
In the one gospel, Jesus talks directly to the centurion. In the other story, he talks to friends of the centurion to come to him and plead the centurion's case.
Right. That's a very good example of what I'm talking about, where the detail may have gotten a little bungled, but the meaning is there. And that's the important thing, is to see the meaning. What is Jesus teaching in that story? He's not teaching us about, it's like the landowner and the harvest or the vineyard and all that. He's not teaching animal husbandry or, growing vineyards. I mean, he's not talking about wine growing. He's talking about more important spiritual truths of how it affects our lives as human beings. So the Gospels are accurate. They may not be exactly factual. Now there's a difference there. Doesn't take away any of the meaning by any means, but it simply means that the story, the meaning, the teaching, and the impression behind it is absolutely right. But depending on how many of the little nitpicky details, you don't get all hung up with the, you know, the forest for the trees type of thing, and get all, you know, at one time scholars were worried about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. Come on, what does that have to do with anything? Zero. Okay? There are many people that get all hung up, and you'll hear them on the radio and on, you know, talking about hell and heaven, and who's been there? I mean, how do they know? They don't. Jesus said in the Gospels are very clear, you know, listen, concern yourself with things here on earth. Whatever will be, will be. You won't know the time and the hour. What was it, that radio guy that always was telling us exactly when the world was going to end? He was reading the numbers, and he was figuring out how many prepositions. You know, number one, he was using the King James Bible, which was not the original Bible anyhow. And, you know, that old story, if it's not King James, you know, Jesus didn't say it. Number one, Jesus never knew the New Testament. It was written after he died. He never read St. Paul. He never read 1 Corinthians. He never read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's all after he died. He didn't know anything of that. What he knew was the Old Testament, and so he teaches from the Old Testament, and that's why the Old Testament becomes so important to us as Christians, so that we tie in the rabbinic tradition. All right. Now, the other major influence on our history, early history, is St. Paul. Now, St. Paul is interesting because St. Paul's letters actually predate, at least one or two, predate the Gospels themselves. The letters actually were out there before the Gospels were ever written down, or at least one of the letters. Now, St. Paul is interesting, and because of the issues between James and Paul are critical in understanding early Christian history. There were two strains, and this is where we'll take a break here in a minute. There were two strains of early Christianity: Pauline Christianity and James. Those of you who attended my lecture on James will know that, you see, remember Groucho Marx? You'd say a secret word and the thing had come down. That was the secret word for her to go out and start the popcorn. I want to be very, very transparent here tonight. But what I want you to think about is how early Christianity, after the death of Jesus, this seminal event of crucifixion and resurrection, how the early church coped with that. And what we're saying with the Gospels here is important, is that in the very early Christianity, no one knew exactly what to make of Jesus. Even the disciples themselves, they kept asking Jesus throughout his life, are you the Messiah? Are you the, you know? In other words, they weren't exactly clear either to the extent of or who this Jesus was. And after he was crucified, imagine the perplexity of the apostles who had followed this leader, believing that he was the Messiah that would establish the New Jerusalem on earth, reestablish the Davidic kingdom, because that's what the Old Testament called for. There would be a Messiah who would bring the Davidic kingdom back. The reign of David would be restored. The enemies would be eliminated from Israel, and the temple would be reestablished, and this would be God's kingdom on earth. And wonder of wonders, this king who rode in on the donkey, who fulfilled all the Old Testament prophecies, ends up to be killed. Now, if that doesn't wreck your boat, I don't know what would. Because all of a sudden, you as an apostle or a disciple would say, gosh, were we deluded? Were we wrong? I mean, this makes no sense. If this was truly the Messiah, how could the world destroy him? And so the very first thing that the apostles and the early writers had to deal with was, how do we make sense of the crucifixion? There was no book, there was no Bible at the time to tell you anything. There were no theologians that had written anything. This was all by the seat of their pants, having to figure out what this all meant. In fact, even from prison, remember, are you the one, or do we look for another? So this whole perplexity marks the very earliest years of Christianity. What are the dates? We're probably looking at Jesus being born somewhere between 3 and 5 BC. Now you say, now wait a minute. BC, how can he be before Christ? BC before. Well, the dating is off because the calendars were off. And we now know that by looking at the reign of Quirinius, the census and all those other things, we know that Jesus was born approximately in the area, say 3 to 5 BC. And then he lives about 33 years, as close as we can ascertain it. So that puts him out to the crucifixion being around the area of 30. See that? If it's 3 BC, and then you add 33 years, that's 30 AD in the old way of designating calendar. But you could also have it up to 33. When I was in seminary, we said it was about 33 because his age wasn't as tacked down as it is now. But is that important? No. I mean, whether he died at 30 or 33, it's interesting for scholars, and you could write a PhD thesis on it, but it has no relevance other than to sort of date the time period in which we're dealing. So if Jesus dies about the year 30, 33, somewhere in there, and then Paul is writing within about 15 or so years of that, in the first Gospels, are coming there. There's a sort of time gap there. And it's in that period, Paul being the earliest writer in one of his letters, and then this time period in which they're trying to figure it out. Now, a way you can see in the writings that they're trying to figure it out is the experience of the disciples after the crucifixion. When they're locked in the upper room and they're told about the crucifixion, they're dubious about the empty tomb. Remember that? I don't believe that. So Peter and them ran to the tomb, indeed found it, the tomb was empty. Who told them that the tomb was empty? Right, a woman. Now put that in your pipe and smoke it. Now women, and I'm not doing this to cater to you tonight, except to say the first, get this, if you don't write anything else down, write this. The first witness of the resurrection was a woman. Now, as we go through church history, you'll see that women haven't always had their due. But I would say that when you put the mother of Mary as the object that God chose to bear his son, as a woman, I mean, God could have chosen anyway. He could have just had him come out of heaven on a big throne, or he could have just a big lightning bolt, boom, and then you've seen those magicians?
Yes.
When I was younger, I saw Blackstone, the magician. I don't remember Blackstone. That may be a name of ancient history. I know that's in 1800s, but but Blackstone would sometimes come in, and the stage would be dark, and of course for dramatic effect, and then there'd be this huge big explosion, boom, like that, and he would appear there with his black cape, right, in the explosion. Well, imagine Jesus, here I am. But God didn't choose Cecil B. DeMille approach. He chose a woman, a common birth. That should tell you something. When you do biblical studies, you look for things which seem unusual. You know, if you and I were God, we wouldn't have chosen that route, probably. We wouldn't have chosen to have Jesus born in a podunk place called Bethlehem or Nazareth, you know. I mean, if you're going to make a splash, you go to New York, right? Or Hollywood, or Rome, you know. But a backwater, nothing place to have the Messiah born is so rather than you know miss that point, you say, now what did he have in mind there? What was his point? And we could have a great discussion about that. And those are the things, see, I look for in Scripture. I look for those little quick turns of events, those little interesting twists, the things that say, gee, that seems so unusual. Why did he do that when he did that? See, it's like an old professor of mine used to say, you always have to see what's happening within what's happening. Now listen to that. You have to ask what's happening within what's happening. See, that's the way I read Scripture. I don't read it just as a literal story. I read it as what is the intention of Jesus to teach then and now? How does that apply to my life? What would Jesus do if he were here teaching that story? And how would he frame it? So the apostles and the disciples, I'm counting down in my mental clock that about 2 minutes the popcorn will be ready. So this is called, this is in television work, they go like this. If you're on television, it means stretch it out. You know, you've got the clock, you've got 30 seconds, you got 60 seconds to fill. Okay, so they go like this. When I used to do TV, they'd say, yeah. With me, they'd go like that. Shorten it up. No, not actually. But the point is, you see, the disciples, the apostles, had to figure this out. There was no manual. Jesus didn't give them an operating manual. He didn't say, okay, here it is. It's all written down here. Just follow what I taught. They had to put it all together. They didn't have anything written down. They had their memories. They had their experiences, as the gospel writers did. And so they had to make sense of all this. And this is what is happening in this first century, this first 100 years, in which Paul's writing all these letters, trying to figure it all out. And the gospel writers are trying to remember, lest it be forgotten, the important and critical things in the life of Jesus. And it's in this flux, in this wonderful period of time in which the whole birth of Christianity is coming to be. And it's very amorphous. It's not, you know, it's not cast in stone. It's not like this and this. It's like this and this and this and this. And as a result, all these, like these, all these shoots, all these opinions, all these different viewpoints and so on are going to have to eventually be molded and shaped into a common core. Now, I know that's a bad word anyway, for some people anyway, common core. But what I mean is common core, it means a common thread, a common teaching. What is the essentials of the faith? And after you eat your popcorn, you're going to find out how this all comes to be. Okay, thanks.